The importance of the early years. There is a strong relationship between early life experiences and how a baby will develop cognitively, socially, emotionally and physically throughout their lives. This is recognised in the early years framework, which states, "It is during our very earliest years and even pre-birth that a large part of the pattern for our future adult life is set." Brain development, making and shaping connections. More is known about the developing brain now than ever before as a result of advances in technology and neuroscience. It is known that babies are born with a unique personality and an adaptable brain, with a high degree of plasticity, which is ready to be shaped by relationships and experiences. Babies have already started to learn in the womb, particularly in the last trimester.
We now know that towards the end of pregnancy, babies in the womb swallow the amniotic fluid, which is, in turn, the chemistry of that is affected by what the woman eats. So there's been research showing that if women eat very spicy food, the babies, when they're born, are more likely to turn to the spicy smells. They learn to enjoy the food they're going to taste later. It's also known that they can learn to respond to particular music. Again, at the end of pregnancy, there's one study where women who listened to the soap opera Neighbours a lot, when the baby was born, if the tune of the Neighbours was played, the baby looked up and alert, and they didn't respond to other music in the same way. So there is evidence that this is really at the end of pregnancy, the last 6-8 weeks. Babies do start to learn in a way that will prepare them for what they're going to respond to in the world outside.
The baby is born hardwired. One of the few things we are hardwired to do is to relate. Babies are born exquisitely sociable, and you've only got to pick up a newborn baby to see that they seek out eye contact, and that's hardwired, and to see that they mimic facial expressions, that's hardwired. So all the fun things like sticking your tongue out or yawning or holding your hand up, the baby will respond to. Babies are hardwired to make social interaction, and that is because socialization is so important for humans. We need to be socialized in order to build the right structures in our brain that we're going to need for the rest of our life. We're not genetically set up for any particular environment, we're genetically set up to be adaptable, and what we adapt to is the first caregiving environment.
Within Shotts Nursery Centre, we're becoming more aware of the recent research in terms of brain development. We're able to access the new material in terms of the research, the work that's carried out by Robin Balberney, Dan Hughes, Helen Minnis, and their work on attachments. So it's through the work and the ongoing CPD, the work that we have with the psychologist, the work that we have with the learning support teacher, but also in terms of the reflection that we have as a staff team to use within our own development. Because without gaining the information that's out there at the moment, we're not going to move forward. We're not going to enable the staff to become confident in their own learning and to value themselves as practitioners and supporting the early developments of the young infant.
It is estimated that at birth, a baby's brain contains thousands of millions of brain cells, and some of these are already connected and communicating. For example, at birth, the most primitive part of the brain, our brain stem, which is at the base of the brain, is already strongly connected or hardwired. It is the early experiences and developing relationships that cause the connections in the brain to increase rapidly. Forming and reinforcing connections are the key tasks of early brain development. Babies are born with what is referred to as a predisposition for learning. They are naturally curious about the world around them, and especially the people who engage with them. Whilst babies are eager to learn, they require positive and consistent relationships to support them on this journey. Babies are programmed to look to other people to help them make sense of their world.
Relationships are central. We know that relationships affect the growth of the mind in two different ways. If we see the mind as being psychological, you internalize the relationships that you've had with your parents and caregivers and early years staff, and they go into a sort of mental map that you keep with you for the rest of your life. Bowlby talked about internal working models, but really these are just the unspoken assumptions of yourself within a relationship what will happen when you relate to people, how they will relate to you, your expectations of whether this will be productive and fruitful and caring and loving or not. And within that sort of mental map of relationships are things like self-esteem, confidence, cognitive ability, willingness to explore, willingness to take risks, the capacity for empathy, the capacity for putting yourself in somebody else's shoes, which is the biggest single inhibitor against violence that we know of. On the other part of relationships is they physically structure the growth of the developing brain. The brain is an organ exquisitely attuned to the quality of early relationships, and this is designed by nature so we can fit into the early mothering environment, which is our first stage into being humanized. The quality of the early relationships that the baby and then toddler has will leave an indelible imprint on the architecture of the brain, so that the final shape of the brain, if you like, the way the brain is sculpted by early experience, will reflect the quality of that early experience. So good quality early relationships will give the child the optimum start in life.
Well, the child has a very, very strong instinct to find other people because they're the only thing in the world that can confirm their belonging. I mean, their need to be part of a community. They have to be a community with people so they can form a private world. I mean, we all have a kind of, if you like, attachment to the house we live in or the room we sleep in, or, you know, or the objects that we possess. And babies can be like that too, but really they can't have companionship with an object. So babies are looking for companionship, looking for somebody. You just have to have company, good company. And that company can be of any age. And there's something which I'd like to emphasize, that certainly by the time a baby is 3 or 4 months old, siblings, older siblings, can be very good companions and play with the child happily. And I think that by the time a baby is 6 months old, they can get along fine with a group of other kids of different ages. I agree with Bruce Perry, who says that what the human brain is looking for is relationships, or yes, engagements. And it's not with just one person. So there's a qualification for attachment. Babies do, especially when they're distressed, want the care and concern of somebody who they know well and who's affectionate. So they do have a strong attachment to their mother who looks after them. But the companionship, having fun, that they like to have that with their mother too, but they can have it easily with lots of other people, including their fathers, actually. What the baby's trying to do is to become a respected member of a community, somebody who knows things. So the main purpose of communication is to belong to a world with other people, with common understanding.
By the end of their first year, with appropriate care and support, babies vastly overgrow the number of connections they actually need. This is to enable them to test billions of different connections or neural pathways for every action they take. Grasping an object has been mastered by this baby, and the neural pathway is becoming well established. However, retrieving it when dropped by trying to coordinate what she sees with controlling her hands and body is a new challenge. But we know the baby's brain has been preparing for this by vastly overgrowing the number of connections she actually needs, enabling her to test billions of alternative pathways for every action she takes, in this case successfully retrieving the lemon. An important process of elimination begins towards the end of the first year, as the baby's brain starts to prune itself, thus creating the most efficient structure to suit the environment and culture. The physical, cognitive, social and emotional experiences a child has will determine which permanent connections are made and which are no longer needed. In the case of physically retrieving the lemon, whenever the baby gets close, the best connections carry the strongest signals and survive. Those connections carrying no signal begin to wither and die. This process remains the same for creating permanent connections in relation to experiences of physical, cognitive, social or emotional development.
The neurons that fire together wire together, so that whatever a child experiences, and that includes not just the immediate interpersonal experiences, but the whole ambience of the home and the wider culture, will leave an indelible imprint on the circuits of their mind as the neuronal networks that are responsive to that particular experience wire together. The second principle of brain wiring, this is very crude, is use it or lose it. What a child is not exposed to tells the brain that these aren't circuits I need to keep, and the brain has to whittle down the amount of circuits it has, because there simply isn't enough room in any of our skulls for all the potential circuitry that we're born with. So we have to discard circuits. This is a normal process. But the brain discards them on the basis of use it or lose it. So what's not being used is got rid of. And you can see that most clearly with language development. Whereas a child can babble in every language under the sun, they can only talk in one language, and they've got rid of the circuits for recognizing and producing the phonemes and sort of vowel sounds of that other language. Well, just as children do that with language, so they do that with an emotional language, and children will keep the emotional language that they are born into, and they'll lose the potential emotional language that they haven't been exposed to.
Brain development takes place through interactions with others, being active and involved, and learning through exploration and discovery. As babies and young children revisit and practice skills and language, they return to previous connections in the brain. Every time the pathway is revisited, it is strengthened and the link speeds up. These pathways are strengthened by fatty sheaths being laid down, a process known as myelination. More commonly, this process is known as hardwiring, and 90% of the hardwired connections will be complete by the age of 3 years.
Basically, brains are born with all the cells they're going to have. I mean, around the edges a bit, it looks like you can create new cells, but for the most part, it's not cells that's being created in brain development, it's cells talking to each other. So a cell looks a little bit like an upside-down hand, and so you get a number of these cells in your brain, and you're born with those, and what happens is that those cells learn to talk to each other. They're forming something called synapses. And it's the synapses that for the most part aren't in our brain. I mean, there are synapses, but a lot more synapses are going to be generated. I like to think of it as motorways in the brain. So if you walk across a green field that has grass in it, you'll lay down the grass, and if you turn around and look behind you, you'll be able to see that grass that's been laid down, but in a few hours it will pop back up and you'll never see it. Nobody will be able to see that someone's been walking across. But if you go across it regularly, a path gets established. And then if you continue to go across it, I don't know, the council might need to come along and cobble it in order to prevent erosion. And then before very long, perhaps motorcyclists and cars will come along it, and then they'll need to tarmac it. And we'll have an A-class road. And before very long, we'll have so many cars going across it that they'll think, we better put a motorway in here. So it's like a transport system. That's what's happening with messages, is that they're getting sent. And if they get sent over and over and over again along that road, it gets more and more robust. So myelination and other processes happen in the brain to really make that a robust pathway, a robust road that can send messages really fast. But if the council were to have come along and said, we shouldn't have put the motorway here, we should have put the motorway here, it will cost a lot of money to change the motorway system. It will be very hard to do that. It will take a long time to do that. Brains are just like that. Once your motorway system is in place, once it's sending the messages that it's figured out it needs to send to survive in this environment, i.e. An environment where there's lots of shouting, an environment where adults come quickly when you are upset, an environment when adults don't come quickly when you're upset. We can cope with all of this because we're developing a motorway system to cope with the particular world that I got born into. But once the motorway system is in place, it's very hard to change it. And that motorway system is in place, for the most part, by the time the child is 3. Many people haven't realized up till now how sensitive the brain is in relation to the environment, that it's really developing in relation to the environment. We are getting brains to develop particular motorway systems. We should be asking ourselves, what kind of motorway system do we want our children to develop?
Every child deserves the best start. Research has shown that external influences, such as the mother's experiences during pregnancy, can adversely affect the development of the baby's brain and the connections being made.
Research over the last 10 years has really shown that how the baby develops in the womb has a big effect on their health for the rest of their life. And this is true for the physical health. We know that babies that are born smaller at birth are more likely to have vulnerability to cardiovascular disease and actually die of cardiovascular disease in their 70s. But we also know that there's a big effect on neurodevelopment. The emotional state of the mother while she's pregnant affects how the baby's brain develops in the womb. There's research showing that if the mother is more stressed, more anxious, her fetus develops in a way that makes the later child more likely to suffer from anxiety or depression themselves, more likely to have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, more likely to have conduct disorder, more likely to have cognitive problems. A whole range of different problems that the child will be more at risk from if the mother is stressed while she's pregnant.
Babies are born ready to adapt and create connections in the brain to suit the environment they meet. This ability also makes humans vulnerable when placed in less positive circumstances, where the negative impact may last a lifetime. Babies and young children who have positive emotional bonds with adults produce consistently lower levels of the stress hormone, cortisol. It is therefore important that staff recognise the potentially powerful impact that their practice can have in supporting children so that they can go on to develop positive and healthy relationships throughout life.
The early relationships that the baby is automatically forced to adapt to by nature, and this has happened to all of us, will tell the brain that these are important circuits, these are circuits you need, or these are circuits you don't need. So a baby who's been brought up in loving, caring relationships will keep the circuits associated with love and care and empathy. A baby brought up with secure attachments will keep the circuits to do with making relationships, with being able to explore, being able to be curious, being able to make the best use of their brain. Whereas another baby who's been surrounded by maltreatment, and when I use the term maltreatment, I'm referring to all forms of neglect as well as all forms of abuse, provide the antithesis of a loving environment, and the brain is forced to adapt to that quality of caregiving, so that they will keep the circuits needed for immediate survival, such as hypervigilance, a well-activated stress response. They won't need the circuits for empathy or love or care because they haven't experienced them, so the brain won't recognise them, and these circuits will be discarded.
Babies and young children need secure and nurturing relationships. It is essential that staff working in early years settings recognise the need for all service providers to work together with families in order to get it right for every child.
The fact that babies are so tuned in to other people and need other people so much to help them interpret the world is actually quite exciting. Sometimes I think we've not valued how important parents are to their children, because we think that what they want is this independence and looking out at the world. They do want that, but they want to share that with their parents, because it's their parents' facial expressions and their parents giggling and their parents sharing with them that helps them to make sense of that world. It's exciting to understand that babies come into the world not just wanting us, but actually needing us, and that will influence their brain development.
Recognising individual needs. All babies and young children are individual and unique. They have distinctive temperaments and behaviours. This is due to a combination of genetics and learning which has started in the womb. Tuning into babies and developing a special relationship with them means that staff are able to recognise each individual child's needs and be sensitive and responsive to them. Adults can support brain development in babies and young children by developing warm, caring relationships with them, being responsive to their unique needs, rhythms and personalities, upholding their rights, encouraging exploration and play while being companionable and attentive, promoting health and well-being and encouraging good nutrition, working in partnership with parents, carers, families and other agencies, surrounding them with stimulating experiences, singing, talking, telling stories, establishing routines and providing consistency and stability.
Relationships are central to all the work we do with young children, and the relationship that the mother has with the baby, of course, begins in utero. So it's really important that staff think through relationships, both the relationships that they can form themselves with the children in their care, and also looking at how they can promote and aid and catalyse the relationships that the caregivers, whether they're parents or somebody else, have with the very small children that they're looking after. I think it's paramount for practitioners to realise that the relationships they make with the parents and the relationships they make with the children and the relationships that they encourage between the parents and the children are the most important thing that they can do. And to do that, it's very easy to say, but it is very difficult and needs a lot of skill. It's not something that comes easy. People need skill, they need reflective supervision, and they need support, and they need time.
All adults working with Scotland's youngest children must demonstrate through their practice their awareness that every child has the right to a positive start in life, through respectful relationships which show responsive care. In this way, Scotland's youngest children can be nurtured to develop a capacity for love, empathy, respect, resilience, positive relationships, and the chance to succeed.